Dear God, thank you for today. Thank you for the opportunity we have to gather and to hear what Peter has to share with us. I pray that we are challenged and encouraged by his words, that they are able to resonate with us and give us things to ponder as he discusses evil and how it impacts us and how we view our world and those around us. So I want to pray for him and the words he's going to share with us today. In your name we speak. Amen.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I think this is the third year I've spoken here, which is a good sign. Apparently, it's not hard to get. I've been told by Andy Bannister, who works for Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, and he says, it's not that hard to get invited to speak somewhere, but the tricky part is getting invited back, because you know, after you finish speaking, everybody will say something nice, but if they didn't really like you, they won't invite you back. But if you get invited back, this is the second time now, it means it went well. So I'm glad to be back again. Yeah, I just got back from Brazil and had a really good time there. I never went to South America before, and I didn't know any Portuguese, but I learned a few words when I was down there. Does anybody know Portuguese? Anybody? Okay. So I learned some words there that were like slang or fun words, and I could say them at the beginning of my talk. And I would just tell them about the new words I learned, and everybody would laugh. And it was great. I don't know why they're laughing, but I could just say it. But I obviously can't do that now, because you're not going to find it at all enjoyable or funny or anything like that. I was hoping maybe one person would like it, but no, it's not going to happen that way. So I know that, I don't know if I should even say this, but I was originally going to talk about evil next week and a moral argument for the existence of God this week, but I've switched them around. And so I'm talking about the other one. I hope nobody came here specifically for one of the talks and not the other, because you might be a little disappointed, but hopefully not. Hopefully you'll like both of them. Bart Ehrman is someone who used to be a Christian, but is not anymore. Have any of you heard of Bart Ehrman before? Okay, 2 times now. Nobody's heard. That's okay, I'll tell you who he is. He was somebody who became a Christian as a teenager, and then he was excited about serving God. He went to Moody Bible College in Chicago, and then he went to Wheaton College, the famous evangelical seminary in the United States. And he was going to live his life to glorify God in the academy. So he went to Princeton Seminary to do his PhD. If you know about Princeton Seminary, it's not as conservative as Moody or Wheaton. And while there, you know, he was excited, he was writing papers, but he had a moment when his faith started to falter. He wrote a paper in which he argued that he tried to reconcile some problem in the Bible. And he wrote this great little paper, and his professor just wrote back a little note at the end of the paper saying, well, maybe this author of the gospel, I don't remember if it's Mark or Matthew, maybe he just got it wrong. And Bart Ehrman said that was the moment when his faith started to disappear. Or I don't know if you'd use the word disappear, but he became increasingly liberal after that. And then eventually he gave up on Christianity altogether. And he now describes himself as an atheist, at least in respect to the Christian God. The thing that really convinced him of that atheism was the whole problem of evil. He became convinced evil is real, and therefore at least the Christian God doesn't exist. And he wrote a book about this whole issue. Why, it was something like why the Bible doesn't answer the most important issues of life, and where he criticized the Bible on this whole issue. And here's one of the things that he wrote. He said, we live in a world in which a child dies every 5 seconds of starvation. Every 5 seconds. Every minute there are 25 people who die because they do not have clean water to drink. Every hour, 700 people die of malaria. Where is God in all this? We live in a world in which earthquakes in the Himalayas kill 50,000 people and leave 3 million without shelter in the face of oncoming winter. We live in a world where a hurricane destroys New Orleans. where a tsunami kills 300,000 people in one fell swoop, where millions of children are born with horrible birth defects. And where is God? To say that he will eventually make right all that is wrong seems to me now to be pure wishful thinking. A lot of times when we are talking to somebody who's not a Christian and we want to share our faith, this issue will often come up. How can a good God allow for so much suffering, so much evil in the world? And a lot of times for Christians themselves, just like for Bart Ehrman, this issue comes up. A lot of times it's not something we think about, but something really bad suddenly happens in life, and suddenly it is an issue. I remember attending a church in California and had a friend there who came to like a little apologetics group that I was a part of. Was a good guy, seemed to have a good relationship with God. He had someone in his family pass away and die a very agonizing, difficult death. And after that, he became an atheist. I remember thinking, how did this happen, right? He was living for God, and now he's this serious, committed atheist. A lot of other apologetics issues that we talk about don't always hit home close to us, but this is something that can oftentimes be very personal. And something to recognize about this is that there's a difference between the intellectual issue and the emotional issue. We oftentimes address this issue and want to talk about it in an intellectual way. People will say, why does God allow evil? They're looking for an answer. And they claim to or seem to be addressing this on a purely intellectual level. But the truth is, a lot of times, people are not really interested in the intellectual issue. What's really going on is that they have pain that they have experienced in their life. Deep, real, serious pain. Someone they love has died. Some tragic thing has happened in their life. And they have this deep pain inside, and they're asking because of that pain. And a lot of times they're looking for answers in order to make that pain go away. And it's quite possible that someone is here today, or maybe listening to this one day on the internet, and they're doing that for that purpose. They want answers to make that pain go away. And the first thing we need to establish or understand is it doesn't matter whether there's a perfect answer to why God allows pain or suffering or evil. It's not going to make the pain go away. If someone you love has died and you're full of sorrow for that and you're looking for answers, even if you find the perfect answer, that loved one is not going to come back to life because you found that answer, right? And if you love that person deeply, you're going to miss them. It's going to hurt terribly to not have them around. And even if you know why God allows pain and evil, it's still going to hurt. So if you're looking for an answer to this intellectual question to make that pain go away, I want to encourage you to realize it's not going to make it go away. Now, it might help a little bit, but the pain is still going to be there. Someone who's dealing with an emotional issue needs love and care. They need someone to grieve with them. That's the best we can do. In the Bible, Job suffered terribly because God allowed him to be tested. And his friends came to him and tried to give him all these answers and all this stuff. It didn't really help him. What he really needed is someone just to sit there and mourn with him. In James, it says to mourn with those who mourn and rejoice with those who rejoice. I think a lot of times that's what we need to do. We need to be aware, if you have someone you're talking to who's hurting, giving them an intellectual answer is not necessarily going to really help them. But there's other people who are really looking for an intellectual answer to this question. And if you put your arm around them and say, God loves you, I love you, and let's cry together, they're kind of like, what the heck? This isn't what I'm looking for, right? They're looking for an intellectual answer. They're not necessarily dealing with a personal pain, and they're more exploring this intellectually. So if that's more where you're coming from, then I think some of the things I share today could be helpful. But let's just keep that distinction in mind. There's a difference between the emotional issue and the intellectual issue. They can be intertwined, yes, but the answer to one isn't necessarily the answer to the other, right? Now, what people always want to know when it comes to this issue is, well, why does God allow evil? And I want to share with you my idea on this. An answer to that question is called a theodicy. And Christians have different theodicies they provide. I want to share with you mine. But before I get to that, I want to make another point. And that is, evil can actually be a reason to believe that God exists. And I think it's actually a good reason, a good argument for the existence of God can be made from the reality of evil. Now, I know you might think that's crazy, because everybody always points to evil as a reason that God does not exist. But I would actually say it's the opposite. The existence of evil shows that God is real. Now, before you think I'm crazy and you decide to get up and walk out, let me explain to you why I'm saying that. Whenever you see any kind of tragic event happen, let's say a terrorist blows themselves up in Paris. A while back ago we had some terrorist activities in Paris. But let's just imagine it's a suicide bomber that blows himself up in some city. Paris, London, New York, doesn't matter. There's two ways you can describe that event. One set of words simply describes what happened. Doesn't make any judgment. It just describes what happened. And in this set of words, you use things like death, pain, sadness, sorrow. All it's doing is observing what has happened. Not making any judgments, just observing what has happened. There's been death, there's been pain, there's been sorrow, there's been sadness. But there's another set of words that you can use. And this goes one step further. It doesn't just observe, it makes a judgment. This set of words includes things like evil, wrong, horrible, tragedy. Whenever you have something like a suicide bombing happening, a natural disaster, people don't just use that first set of words. They don't just describe what happens. They don't just say there's death and pain and sadness and sorrow, although they could do that. They go a step further and they use this other set of words that makes a judgment. Evil, wrong, horrible, tragedy, etc. So there's this key difference. One makes a judgment, the other does not. And the judgment that this other set of words is making is that this is not the way that things are supposed to be. There's a strong departure from the way that things are supposed to be. You can have small departures from the way that things are supposed to be. If you have a son or daughter and they don't do their homework, you should do your homework. It's basically you're basically saying this is the way things are supposed to be. You're supposed to do your homework. But that's not a strong departure. When we use words like evil, horrible, tragedy, we're saying this is a very strong departure from the way that things are supposed to be. But notice something. When you make that judgment, you're saying this is not the way that things are supposed to be, even if other people think it is. Right? So when you say a suicide bomber that blew themselves up, when you say that's evil, you're using that word and you mean that's not the way that things are supposed to be, even if Al-Qaeda or ISIS or some group thinks it is. They might think it's good, but you're saying it's evil, even if they think it's good. You're saying this is not the way that things are supposed to be, independent of what anybody else thinks. But now if you're saying this is not the way that things are supposed to be, independent of what other people think, then the flip side to that is that there is a way that things are supposed to be, independent of what anybody thinks. Right? Follow me? If you say there's a way that things are not supposed to be, independent of what anybody thinks, means there's also a way that things are supposed to be, independent of what anybody thinks. But now how do you make sense of this? What you're essentially saying is there's a design to the way that we are supposed to live our lives. And the truth of that design is not based in our thoughts. That only makes sense if there is some mind. Design only comes from a mind. If there is some mind that designed us to live in a particular way. Because if it's independent of the way we think, the truth of that design, of how we're supposed to live, has to be based in something outside of our mind. What are you going to base it in? The physical world doesn't do it for you. You can't point to a table, the sun, trees, and say, because this tree exists, because the sun exists, therefore we are supposed to live in this way. Does it make sense? There has to be something that's non-physical, that's a mind, that designed us to live in a particular way. But what you're really talking about is God. It might not necessarily yet be the Christian God, but there must be some being, some mind that designed us to live in a particular way. Otherwise, there is no way that we are supposed to be. There's just the way we behave, and that's it. And you can't say there's a way we're supposed to be or not supposed to be. There's just what is. Think of this in another way. Imagine you had two rocks flying through space, comets or asteroids. I don't know what's the technical word, but they're two rocks flying through outer space for millions and millions of years. Not doing anything, not interacting with anything, just flying through space. Is there anything good about that? Well, no. They're just moving through space. It's not good. Is there anything evil about that? Again, the answer is no. There's nothing good or evil about it. They're just rocks flying through space. They're just particles in motion. Now imagine if suddenly these two rocks, these two asteroids or comets, they suddenly smash into each other. And they break apart into millions of different pieces. Is there anything good about that? No. Is there anything evil? No. They're just molecules in motion rearranging themselves. There's nothing good. There's nothing evil. There's just what is. There's no way that those rocks are supposed to be. There's just the way they are. Now, if that makes sense to you, think of this other situation. Imagine if there's a table in front of me here, and there's some molecules arranged on this table, and these molecules are arranged not in the shape of a rock, but in the shape of what people call a baby. Okay? Now imagine there's some other molecules next to this thing people call a baby, and people call these molecules a knife. Imagine if these molecules here pick up these molecules here, and then move these molecules into this baby-shaped molecule. A lot of molecules come out. People call that blood. And then these molecules here pick up the baby and start to eat it. There's a lot of molecules moving around there. Is there anything good about that? Is there anything evil? Well, if it's just molecules moving around, the way those rocks are through outer space, there's nothing evil either. There's just molecules rearranging themselves. But all of us know that's not true. All of us know that's evil. Because all of us know that the way we are supposed to behave, our lives, are not just molecules moving around. There is a design to how we are supposed to live. And that design is independent of what we think. So even if someone thinks this is good, all these molecules move around in front of me, they're wrong. It's evil. Because there's a design to how we are supposed to live, independent of what we think, because we are not just molecules in motion. And that only makes sense because there is a mind, there's a God that designed us how to live. What I'm saying is, if God does not exist, evil does not exist. Suffering and pain can exist. We can still describe things as death, pain, suffering, sorrow. All of that can be true regardless of whether God exists. But evil, wrong, tragedy, horrible, all those descriptor words, none of that makes sense unless there is a God who designed us to live in a particular way. So do you understand now, when I say evil actually shows that God exists, this is what I mean. Evil doesn't make sense as a concept, as an idea, unless God exists. So it's one of the first things to recognize. Evil actually points to the existence of God. So people want to know, why does God allow evil to occur? Great question. Really good. But regardless of whether there's a good answer to that or not, if you are convinced that evil is real, that only makes sense if God exists. Whether or not you know why God allows evil is independent of whether God really exists. You might have no idea why God causes evil, allows for evil. That doesn't change the fact that he still exists. If you say that God does not exist, there is ultimately no evil. A lot of times, atheists are very reluctant to acknowledge this point. They will talk about evil, but suddenly when you talk about how it points to God, then they want to say, oh yeah, there is no evil. Or they get confused and talk about something else. But on rare occasions, atheists will acknowledge that. Richard Dawkins wrote a book called River Out of Eden. There's a famous few lines in that book when he said the following: in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither cares nor knows. DNA just is. And we dance to its music. That's a very telling admission. Notice those few key lines. And of course, this is all predicated on the assumption that God does not exist. There is at bottom no design, no purpose. If you have no design, no ultimate purpose, then there is no evil. There is no good. There's nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. In this moment, Richard Dawkins gets it. The thing is, nobody lives their life that way. Everybody lives their life believing there's real good and real evil. And what that shows is that we sense God really does exist, because evil is real and good is real. Now, I want to talk now about why I think God allows evil to occur. But I want to point out, Christians have different ideas about this. I'm going to share with you my view about this. You might like it, you might not. If you don't like it, that's okay. This isn't something that's contained in the Bible, and other Christians have different ideas. So I'll share this with you. I find it intellectually satisfying. I hope you do too. If you don't, that's all right. This isn't something I'm declaring that all Christians have to believe, but I think you'll at least find it stimulating and interesting. First of all, one thing to realize before we even talk about this, though, I'm convinced this issue ultimately comes down to trust. We need to trust that God has a good reason. And this is true even if no evil existed. In other words, we need to trust that God is perfectly good, and we would still need to trust even if we were never exposed to evil. If we are all born in heaven, and the only thing we ever knew was pure bliss, we would still need to trust that God is good. Why? Because if you're in heaven long enough, you're going to think everything that could eventually be thought. Or at least you're going to increasingly think of more and more things. Tom's here, and he studies philosophy, so I'm on my toes, because I know he's going to catch me and stuff. So you're going to probably eventually, at some point, think about this possibility. What if God is not perfectly good? What if he's just pretending to be good? What if, in fact, he's really evil? He's pretending to be good and giving everybody bliss for 100 million years. And after 100 million years, he's going to send everybody to hell for all of eternity. And the only reason he gave everybody 100 million years of bliss is to make hell all that much more horrible. Because you'll remember how wonderful heaven was, and then hell will seem all that much more horrible. Imagine you think this in heaven. You've been there for 50 million years. Suddenly it dawns on you, what if God is just pretending to be good? And so you decide, well, I'm going to go to God and ask him. He'll tell me. So you go to God and he says, oh, no, don't worry, I'm not doing that. But you think, that can all be part of the deception. God is just lying to me because he's pretending to be good. And you start thinking about how you could figure this out, how you could decide with certainty whether God was perfectly good or not. The truth is, nothing you do or say or think could ever prove it one way or another. In the end, you would still need to trust that God is perfectly good. Because anything God says or does, anything you think, could all be part of this elaborate deception. There is no way you could prove that God is perfectly good. In the end, you would still need to trust. And if you weren't willing to trust, and you doubted not only that God was perfectly good, but maybe that he was all-powerful, you might try to think of some way to overcome God so that he doesn't send you to hell. I kind of think that maybe this is what Satan was thinking when he decided to rebel against God. There's some biblical data there in the Bible that suggests that Lucifer, Satan, was a perfectly good or very powerful angel, and they rebelled against God. And that a lot of this had to do with pride. But have you ever thought, why would Lucifer rebel if he can't win? Isn't that like the stupidest thing you could do? But maybe it's not the stupidest thing you can do if, first of all, you don't trust that God is all-powerful. You think maybe somehow God could be defeated. And somehow you think there's some better thing that you can get to by defeating or fighting against God. Now, I don't claim to know Satan's psychology with any certainty. A lot of this is BS, biblical speculation. But I think it could possibly be the case. I just throw it out there as food for thought. My main point, though, is not to do with Satan. My main point is all of us would need to trust that God is perfectly good and he's all-powerful, even if we never experienced any evil. And I would suggest that the person who cannot trust here on earth that God has a good reason for allowing evil is the same person who would not trust that God was perfectly good in heaven. And I suggest that's part of the reason God can't let everybody in heaven, because not everybody will trust him. So this issue ultimately, though, comes down to trust. Do you trust that God is perfectly good and he has a good reason, even if you don't ultimately know with certainty, or maybe you don't even claim to know the reason at all? Another thing to think about is God is not necessarily obligated to tell us why he allows evil. It could be that if God reveals the reason to us, it would actually thwart the reason that he has. Perhaps the reason he has would be ruined if he told us why. He maybe can't tell us till we all get to heaven. Perhaps there's some reason, but it's too complicated for us to understand. It would be like Einstein explaining his theories to a dog. The dog just would have no idea what he's talking about. Perhaps there's some reason, but God just can't explain it to us because we're not smart enough. Or maybe it just wouldn't make a difference. In the end, God's purpose will go through regardless of whether we know or not. And God knows he has a good reason, and he doesn't feel like he has to tell us. These are all things to consider about this issue, right? Even before you hear what possible reason there could be. Now, let me go a little bit into my theodicy, my reason for why I think God allows evil. There's two parts to this. There's first something called the free will defense. It goes back to the time of Augustine. And it basically says evil exists because God gave us free will. That is, God created us with the ability to do what is right, but also the ability to do what is wrong. We have genuine love for each other and genuine love for God because he gave us this free will. And if we don't have this free will, we don't have genuine love. If I make a robot and I program that robot to say I love you and do nice things, it perhaps might make me feel good, but it's not real love. That's the idea behind free will. In order for love to be genuine, it must be freely chosen. right? If you don't have that choice, you don't have genuine love. So that's the first part of this. Another idea that's often been suggested to people goes back to an ancient, a patristic father, Irenaeus. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. But he talked about evil allowing our souls to develop. And the idea is when we experience evil, that allows us to produce virtues inside of us. If we deal with someone who's annoying and difficult and takes up our time, that allows us to develop the virtue of patience in our life. If we don't experience that, we can't develop patience in our lives. Only if we are faced with some terrible, dangerous situation can we develop the virtue of courage. So this other idea is that God allows evil in this world so that we can develop these virtues in our lives. I kind of like both of those ideas, but I think it's best if we put them together. I think free will does exist. I think we have free will on this earth, and I think a lot of our evil that we experience is a result of free will. But now here's something to think about. If free will allows for genuine love here on earth, will we have free will in heaven? Now, Christians answer that differently. Some say yes, some say no. But if we have genuine love for God and for each other because we have free will on earth, how can we really love God and love each other unless we have free will in heaven? But if we have free will in heaven, what prevents us from using that free will to do something wrong? Because if we have free will and we start doing wrong things in heaven, heaven's not very heavenly anymore. It's a lot like earth. Not all that great. We're trying to get out of here and we want to go to a place where we don't have that pain and sorrow and sadness, that evil. Now some Christians will say, well, yeah, we won't have free will in heaven, and some people will say either we won't have free will, or maybe we will have free will, but we won't do anything wrong because we won't have our sinful nature anymore. God will change us, give us a new nature. And this new nature will always do what is right. And perhaps we won't do anything wrong because we'll have what's called the beatific vision. It means we'll see God in all his glory and greatness. And when you just see God in all his glory and greatness, you don't ever want to do anything wrong. I think that's part of it, definitely. But here's the thing. It seemed like Lucifer and the angels that rebelled, the demons, were not created with its sinful nature, saw God all his glory, but still chose to do what is wrong. It also seems that Adam and Eve were not created with a sinful nature, and they at least walked with God in the cool of the evening. So maybe they didn't see God in all his glory, but they still encountered God, didn't have a sinful nature, and chose to do what is wrong. So it doesn't seem to me that those two things are enough. And if we have free will in heaven, what's going to prevent us from using our free will from sinning in heaven? Here's my answer. I think God knows, well, let me say it differently. God allows all of us to experience the right amount of evil in this life so that our souls are formed and shaped in a particular way that when we go to heaven, we never use our free will to do anything wrong. Theoretically, we could, but we never will, we never do, because we have experienced so much evil in this world, we know what the consequences are like. And our experience with evil in this world, both the evil from other people and the natural world, shows us that when we rebel against God, when we sin, bad things happen. And if you experience enough of that evil in your life, you become convinced it's not worth doing. It's not worth going that direction. So our souls are formed and shaped in this life in such a way that when we go to heaven, we never use our free will to rebel against God. I also think God has something called middle knowledge, that he knows what everybody would do in every possible situation. So before he creates the universe, he knows when he creates you exactly how much evil you need to experience in this life in order to ensure that you never do anything wrong in heaven. So he never allows any more evil than is necessary. He only allows you to experience enough evil to form and shape your soul in such a way that you never choose to rebel in all of eternity. Now, you might like that idea, you might not. I don't know. I mean, I'm happy to hear from you in a second if we have a moment to talk about it. But remember what I said before. I don't claim to know with any certainty whether this is the right reason or not. And there's other facets to it that I could talk about. I've given you like a simple version of it. I find that intellectually satisfying. But you might not, or you might see some problems with it, whatever it might be. Remember what I said before, it's ultimately about trust. Even if you don't know, do you trust that God has a good reason? Because remember, evil doesn't even make sense unless God exists. There's a movement in philosophy called skeptical theism. And what this says, it's not you're skeptical of the existence of God, but it's saying, if God has a good reason, should you be able to know that reason? And this view argues that if God has a good reason, we shouldn't necessarily be able to know why God allows evil. There are some things, if you claim this is real, this exists, you should be able to see the evidence of that right away, and if you don't, it's probably not there. For example, if somebody says, there's a very small bug in this room. Well, maybe there is, maybe there isn't. I shouldn't expect to know with any certainty whether this bug is here or not. Somebody says there's an elephant in this room, I can know with certainty whether that statement is true or not, right? There's some things that people say that you should be able to know whether that's true or not, right away. There's other things you can't really know, is it true or not? When it comes to the existence of God, should you expect to know whether God has a good reason or not? Tim Keller says, when someone claims that they can't believe God is real because of all the suffering and evil in the world, what they're saying is, I can't think of a good reason, therefore there is no reason. Let me say that again. When a person says, God does not exist because of all the suffering and evil in the world, what they're really saying is, I can't think of a good reason why God would allow all this evil, therefore there is no reason. Now, is that a right assumption to make? Should you expect to know why God does not allow evil? Maybe you do. Maybe you think you're smart enough, know enough, that if there was a reason, you would know it. But let me think about this for a moment. If you never heard or never thought of that theodicy, that idea I just shared with you, I think that should engender some humility on your part. If you thought about this for a while and never even thought of this possibility that I just shared, perhaps you're not as smart as you think. Perhaps you haven't thought of all the possible reasons out there. Perhaps there's some other reason that you haven't even thought of that's the real reason why God allows evil. And perhaps there is a good reason, but you just haven't thought of it yet. And your claim that God can't exist is presumptuous. Okay, let me finish up with this, and then we can have some questions. Hopefully we have some time. A lot of times people assume that God created us as kind of his pets, where he just created us to live a happy, healthy life. Wealthy too, perhaps. And when something bad happens, we can't understand what's going on, because we assume God's purpose for us was just to be happy all the time. Now something bad happened, and our world just gets turned upside down. How could God allow this? We need to realize, especially as Christians, we are not promised a happy, healthy, wealthy life all the time. In fact, Jesus talks about, if you follow me, you will be persecuted, you will suffer. That's what it means to be a follower of Jesus. God did not create us to live a pain-free life. God created us to know him, to love him, to be changed, to be formed and shaped in the likeness of his Son. When we think that this life is all about our happiness, that's when the problem of evil really hits us, especially when we experience some great tragedy in our lives. if you recognize that God's purpose for you is not to live a pain-free life, evil does not become this great difficulty, this great tragedy. You realize this is part of God's plan for your life and for this world. It ultimately comes down to trust, though. Do you trust that God has a good reason? And when you're experiencing that emotional pain in your life, are you willing to trust? Are you willing to trust that God has a good reason? And are you willing to recognize that even if you know an intellectual answer for why God allows evil, it's not going to make that pain go away? Are you willing to endure through that pain and still say, "Blessed be the name of the Lord"? That's all I have to say this morning. Does anybody have any questions? Or does anybody want to come up and field my questions? Or I realized that was maybe a little heavy, but this is an important topic, and I wanted to try to deal with it in its, full heaviness. I hope it was helpful.
So, yeah, it is heavy. But you're talking about once we're all in heaven, all Christians are in heaven. And even those that, I think many people believe that babies and children, the innocent ones that have no chance, let's say babies, and they never experienced evil.
Yeah.
So how would their life be affected in heaven?
Yeah. I want to go, I didn't talk about it, but I want to go, that's one area where I'm just agnostic, but I don't have a good answer. I don't want to pretend that I do. You could also talk about mentally challenged individuals who aren't able to really cognitively understand, what's going on, right? I have a friend who just recently suggested to me one idea. I'm still thinking about it, but it could be the case. He suggested that perhaps babies or mentally challenged individuals will freely choose to do what is right all their lives and don't need to experience evil, or if they're surrounded by enough people who tell them evil is not worth it, it was really bad, that will influence them enough that they won't choose to do what's evil because of, I don't want to say peer pressure, but peer influence, right? Not peer pressure. So that you can have enough people who've experienced evil, said don't go there, that they won't. And God knows what everybody would do, so he knows if he allows these children in there, they'll just do what is right. But maybe that's right, maybe not. I'm still thinking about it. Could be the case. Or maybe God has some other plan for these children or mentally challenged individuals. I don't claim to know for sure. Yeah?
During your intro, you talked about two possible motivations for asking the question, why does God allow evil? One is emotional and the other intellectual.
Yep.
And you correctly pointed out that there's different answers depending on the motivation for that question. In a real world scenario, how do I not put my foot in that? Like, how do you figure out what their motive is so you can give the appropriate answer to them?
Yeah, that's tricky. It's a good question, but it's tricky. And I mean, one way you could start off is by saying, before especially if you're talking to someone, like if I'm speaking in front of a crowd and someone asks a question, I just got to try to answer the question usually in an intellectual way, because it's hard to get into an emotional, heart-to-heart conversation in a context like this, right? People are usually not necessarily going to open up in this type of situation. But one thing, like say if you're talking to one-on-one, you could say, I think it's a great question. I've wrestled a lot with that. Can I just ask you, before I try to address that, when did you start to think about this? Right? When did this become an important issue? And they might share with you, well, it was when my father died in a car crash. And then you could go from there, right? Now, I don't claim the emotional issue is more of a pastoral type issue. I'm not an expert in that field, right? I'm more into the intellectual type stuff. But I know in the end, really, someone's dealing emotional, a lot of times you want to just feel their pain with them. But it all depends on whether they open up with you, right? They won't necessarily do that. But you could maybe just, if it happens like that, you could maybe probe a little bit more, and you could say, so I don't know if I'm going to say it the right way because I don't consider myself great at this, but you might want to say something like, for a lot of people, when they experience some pain in their life, that's when they start to think about this issue. Do you find that interesting, that people start to ask these questions when they experience some pain in their life, right? And then you could also say, I feel there is some good answers to this, but I also don't think for people who are experiencing this pain, that'll make the pain go away. Do you agree with that? So you can kind of say some of the things I just said here, right? And you could say, I think it really is trust in the end, right? There could be some possible reasons, but that doesn't make the pain go away. We ultimately need to trust that God is good. So you start to say some of that, and then you see how they react. But some people could start to demand, no, what is the answer, right? And really they're dealing with the emotional issue. And that puts you in a difficult situation. Do you start to share the intellectual reasons, or do you not try to? Because I don't have a good answer. I think you have to ask the Holy Spirit to guide you and lead you and do the best you can. Yeah?
I'm not saying this is what you're saying.
Okay.
I just want to talk through the situation a bit more. Because I feel like as kids, and maybe this is still true, like you taught that heaven is, there's no sin. Perhaps there's even no knowledge of sin there. I don't know. But as you so rightly pointed out, there was this angelic being that was presumably created, to be good and still manage to commit sin in heaven. So are you saying that going forward, when we are all there in whatever form we are, there is always going to be the potential for more sin, such as pride or what have you, to go on there as it did in the past?
Yeah, I guess essentially what I'm saying is there's the potential, but it will never become actual. There's always, because people will still have free will, they have the potential to sin, but they never actually will because they've experienced evil here. So for some people, that's kind of a scary possibility. But it also comes down to trust. Did God know what he was doing in terms of who he let into heaven? That can be part of it as well. Did God know the right people to let in and the right people to keep out? I would say part of the reason when people, I haven't thought this through carefully, but I would say to some degree people's rejection of the gospel or rejection of God is tied to this issue. So, and I'm not going to try to explain it all, and I'm still thinking it through, but I think those who reject the gospel are the same people who would not trust God and who would ruin heaven. So if God let everybody into heaven, they would ruin it. But God only lets those people in who will trust that he's good and that trust that God is only letting the right people in too as well.
So really what you're trying to do is you're trying to give an explanation of why God will not allow evil in heaven once we're all there.
Why evil will not occur in heaven.
Well,
Yeah.
Evil will not exist anymore. So I think you can find enough scripture that God, the end plan is when we're all in heaven, he doesn't want sin. Sin is conquered. It's finished and done with. So I don't think we have to worry that we may sin again once we're in heaven. Because to me, that's not really reassuring that possibility still exists.
Yeah. So you okay.
Like, I think we can find enough scripture that gives me reassurance that it's not going to happen again. God doesn't want this to happen all over again.
Yeah. Well, we agree in that part that it's not going to happen again. But the question is, why won't it happen again? Will it not?
You're trying to explain your thinking of why it's not going to happen.
Yeah. And like I said before, I grant some Christians will say, no, there's going to be no possibility for sin in heaven, right? And so then you might not like this idea, and that's fine, right? That's why I emphasize this is my opinion, right? But even if there is no possibility for us to sin, how can you know that with certainty, right? God can tell you, but how do you know God is perfectly good, right? You can still have, I think, whether you think there's the possibility of sin or not the possibility of sin, you still need to trust that God is good, right? I think you can't escape that.
But evil is always going to exist. Evil existed before the universe was created. Because where there's good, there also has to be evil. You can't have one without the other. Satan may be evil, but he didn't create evil. Evil had to have already been there for him to be drawn to it. So even after the end times and after we're all in heaven, there's going to be people that don't go to heaven, so where do they go? So wherever some people think of hell as that fiery furnace type of place, or it's wherever they go, it's distant from God. But there's still, what's going to be there? It's going to be the absence of God, which is evil.
Yeah.
So evil's always still going to exist, because you can't have good without evil. So it's like you know, sort of like the peanut butter and jelly. Can't
Okay.
have one without the other
So-
type of thing. But so I think you're right. There's always that possibility for people to sin in heaven. I'm not saying it would happen, but I'm just saying.
Okay. So let me try to address some of the things.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things here, right?
Yeah.
At the beginning, you said that before the universe created, when God only existed, evil must have existed too as well.
Where did evil come from?
I don't think that's true. I think God was perfectly good when he was all by himself, and since nothing else existed, there was no evil. There was the potential for evil, because there's always the potential for God to create the universe and evil to occur. God knew of that potential in his mind, but I don't think evil exists. I don't think you have to have evil in order for there to be good. So I don't agree with that
Why
idea.
would God create evil?
Well, so this goes back to free will. Okay, well, this goes back to the whole question of why would God create the universe in the first place? If God is perfectly good, he doesn't need anything or anybody else. Everything is in a state of perfection because it's only God that exists, the three persons of the Trinity. Why create something? Some people will say, well, he was lonely. Well, no, then that means God is not perfect. Or maybe he was bored. So he made the universe. Well, then God's not perfect again, right? So the question is, well, why did God make the whole universe? Why did God make us? And I think there's two possible answers. William Lane Craig, who's a Christian philosopher I respect a lot, he would say God made us out of love for us. He wanted us to be able to enjoy a love relationship with him. So it's not that God needed anything, but he created us basically for our own sake, for us to be able to experience God's goodness. That's one possible answer. But I think God is infinitely valuable. I'll say this last thing, and then I think we got to finish, right? God is infinitely valuable. I think as an infinitely valuable being, his purpose would be supreme. And I think his purpose is ultimately to glorify himself. I get this from John Piper and the Westminster Confession of Faith. Say God's ultimate purpose is to glorify himself by enjoying himself forever. And this is going to raise other things, other issues probably that I don't know if we'll have time to discuss in this whole group. But I think that's God's ultimate purpose. I think God creates the universe and creatures with free will so that they will worship him because this increases his glory. So think about someone who is a great singer. Imagine I'm a great singer. I'm not, but imagine I am. What is more glorious? For me to stay at home by myself and sing to myself in the shower, or for me to sing in a stadium with 50,000 people, all hearing my singing and then giving thunderous applause afterwards. It's something that would never happen, but just imagine. The latter would certainly be more glorious, I think. But there's no intrinsic difference in me. I'm still the same person who can sing the same. It's just who is able to hear my singing and applaud as a response. And I think it's much more glorious when the audience freely chooses to do it. Not that I create 50,000 robots who all have to applaud, but they choose to applaud. So I'd say God created us with free will so that we could observe his glory and greatness and then worship him as a result. This maximizes God's glory. But in order to maximize his glory in this way, he has to give us free will. In order to give us free will, there has to be the ability for us to do what's evil or wrong as well. So that's where I think evil came from, because God created us with free will, and he created this universe. I'm not going to get into natural evil, but that's a short answer.
But you think that we have free will, but do we really?
Okay, well, the question was, do you think we really have free will? And that's, again, something you have to accept, I think, and trust that we do. I think I should finish now. It's 10:30, right? So let's finish there. Thank you all. If you want to talk more, I enjoy discussing. There's other facets to this issue that we could go down and talk about, like we just did one right now. But I'm not going to try to do that now. Next week, we're going to talk about the moral argument for the existence of God. That's the flip side to this issue. So it's basically the same issue, but a different side of it. So I hope you come back. If you like this week, I think you'll like next week too as well. Thank you all.